All right, so this is 6.3, enhanced for loop for each for arrays. Okay, so we are writing something called an enhanced for loop. Now, there are certain things that an enhanced for loop can't do, that a regular for loop that we've been using can do. So we'll go through the specifics. Hopefully, we're able to not think of this as something that's too hard, but something that we're able to look at and compare and contrast. It says there's a special kind of loop that can be used with arrays that is called an enhanced for loop, otherwise known as a for each loop. Okay, this loop is easier to write. I like it when things are easier, but you can only use it or should only use it in certain instances. Okay, it doesn't involve an index variable, so it's not like for I is assigned 0 as long as I is less than the array length, add 1 each time. It doesn't look like that. It looks a little different. Okay, so with that, it says it just sets up a variable that is set to each value in the array successively. Okay, so it looks something like this, right? For, and then whatever the data type is. So it could be int, right? Then the variable name, a colon, and then whatever the array name is. Okay, it says where the type is a type for the elements, and then you have your array name. The way you would read that is for each variable value in the array name, do this. You may have used a similar loop in APCSP. Remember the APCSP exam? Some of you guys haven't taken the APCSP exam before, but on the APCSP exam, they went and created their own programming language for it, right? They said, hey, you know what? Since we allow you to teach this class in any programming language you want, we use Python here, but we need to all be on the same page. So let's create this pseudocode. And they created for each item in the list and then do different things to it. Okay, in App Inventor, have any of you guys ever used MIT App Inventor before? We use Thunkable in Intro to Computer Science. The reason why we use Thunkable is because it's a lot easier to test in the online emulator in Thunkable. In MIT App Inventor, you download an app and you test it on your phone in real time or test it on your iPad, but there's a lot of bugs in it. I feel like sometimes it doesn't work. And when I taught that at my last school, we used tablets, and I just always was getting problems like, hey, it's not working, it's not connecting. So we used Thunkable instead of App Inventor. Also, App Inventor used to not work on iPhones, but now it does. Okay, so the Java code is over here, and we'll talk about this, what this looks like below here. Here's an example below. High scores, 10, 9, 8, and 8. Okay, these are high scores. Also, we've lined these up. I'm assuming the array in here, Jamal probably got a 10, Emily 9, Destiny 8, Mateo 8. The for each loop looks like this. For, instead of writing like int I, which could if you want, it just said for each value, we create a variable name, and then we pass the array name. So what it will do is it will print out each value. So it will print out 10, it will print out 9, it will print out 8, and then it will print out 8. It will go through the array and print all these out. Okay? You can see how it's just less code and might be easier to write. Now, there are limitations to it, which we'll get into. Down here, if we have a string of names, right, you'd have to write string name and then a colon and then the array that you're dealing with. Remember before, for our for loops, it looked like for I is assigned 0, as long as I is less than the array length, add 1 each time, right? Ends up being a little more code. This allows us to just iterate through it pretty easily. Okay. Thank you. Okay. It says use the enhanced for loop with arrays whenever you can, because it cuts down on errors. So you should try to run your for each loop as much as possible when dealing with arrays, but you can't always use it. It says you can use it whenever you need to loop through all the elements of an array and don't need to know their index and don't need to change their values. But if you actually need to change the values of an array, like if you want to take every item in the array, each element, and multiply it by 2, and then assign it back to the proper index, it won't work. I'll say it again. For each loops do not allow you to change the values that are in the array. God bless you. Okay. It starts with the first item in the array. It starts at index 0 and continues until it hits the last item. This type of loop can only be used with arrays and some other collection of items like array lists, which we'll talk about in the next unit. Okay, so right now, know that you can only use this with arrays and eventually array lists. Okay, so I'll go ahead and reset this. It says try the following code. The for each loop, notice the for each loop with an int array and a string array. Add another high score and another name and run again. So we have this, right? It's exactly what was above there, but it tells us to add another value. So I'll add another value of 7. And then, I don't know, I'll say Nemo. It's my son's name, right? So Jamal 10, Emily 9, Destiny 8, Mateo 8, Nemo 7. Okay. And what we'll do is we'll print out each value that are in the high scores. We'll print it out. And then we'll print out each value that's in names. So just some easier syntax to write. When I run it, okay, you see it printed out the 5 high scores and the 5 names. So that's what a for each loop does. Okay. Each value in high scores. You can name this whatever you want. This is just a variable name. Okay. Says rewrite the following for loop, which prints out the even numbers in the array in an enhanced for each loop. Okay, so we want to write this as a for each loop. This is just our typical for loop, right? So we want to write this as a for each loop. So maybe I'll just like comment out right here. So we want for, and I'll write my open and close parentheses here. We want each item inside of, so I'll say int, and I'll call it, I'll say int v, or maybe just val, right? Int val. And I'll go ahead and put my colon there, and then I'll pass in the array name. So for each value in the list of values, okay, if this value I'm referring to is divisible by 2 evenly, then print out whatever that value is even. Okay, let's run it and see what happens. Okay, and it passed. So once again, I took this loop. You see it right here. I commented it out. And I shortened it to this. And it did the same exact thing. Can you see why maybe this would be preferred for some programmers? They might decide to write it like this. And if I was being typical lazy Mr. Danza, right, I could do int v, right? That's even less letters, right? Look at that. So I was able to shorten all of this up right here. I turned this into that. Doesn't it look beautiful? Right? It's a lot easier. So with that, when you're dealing with a for each loop, you can't always use it. And I'll explain more here in a minute. Not in a minute, in 2 seconds. For each, that word just looks for each. Is it supposed to say for each like that? Or is it supposed to be a space? For dash each. They said for dash each up there. Here, they just said for space each. Right? And here, they did a third different way, and they just said for each. Okay? What if we had a loop that incremented all the elements in the array? Would that work with an enhanced for each loop? I already told you no. Because only the variables in the loop changes, not the actual real array value. We would need an indexed for loop to modify array elements. Okay? So it says the for each loop below cannot change the values in the array because only the loop variable value will change. Run it to see why this is. Then change the loop to an indexed for loop. Okay, so let's just run it and see what we get. Okay, I have my class increment loop, my main method, and then I have an array. And in my array, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 values. Okay. For each value inside values, I want to add 1 to the value. Doesn't let me do that. What it does is, here's what it prints out. Okay. It adds 1 to the value 7, 3, 2, 8, 13, 6. It does it right there, but doesn't actually change the values in the array, because down below here, we printed out all the values in the array, and we got this 6, 2, 1, 7, 12, 5, which are the original values, right? So even though we added 1 to it and then printed it out, that was just a temporary value. It didn't actually change what the value was. Okay. So what does it want us to do here? It says change the loop to an indexed for loop. So when you see indexed for loop, just the for loops that we've dealt with in the past. So check this out. I'm going to comment out line 7 there and change this to a regular for loop. So I'll say for I is assigned 0, semicolon, as long as I is less than values dot length, semicolon, I plus plus, end parentheses. Okay, now, okay, what I want to do is I want to add, so I'll say values of index I, I'm going to go ahead and add 1 to. So it's going to go to index 0, which is 6, and add 1 to. And the new value is going to be values index I. Okay. And then that should remain the same, maybe. Let's run it and see what I get. Oh, I need to write int I. I'm writing my Python code here, int I. There you go. That's better. So I forgot that int out in front there, which it told me, and I corrected it right there. So I changed this, right? We walked through and saw that that doesn't actually change the value. So for each loop doesn't allow me to change the values that are inside the array. Okay, if I want to change the values, I need to use my regular for loop. Okay, and I did that, and I was able to then print that out. Questions on that? It says, note that enhanced for each loops, you might see that word enhanced thrown out in front of it, right? Cannot be used in all situations. Only used for each loops when you want to loop through all the values in an array without changing their values. Okay. Do not use for each loops if you need the index. Do not use for each loops if you need to change the values. We just found that out. Do not use for each loops if you want to loop through only part of an array or in a different order. Okay, this is for starting with the first item and looping right through it. Okay, what are some of the reasons you would want to use an enhanced for each loop instead of a for loop? The answers are right above, right? One is if you wish to access every element of the array, you don't need to use, but you can use it if you want to access every element of the array. 2 is not correct because you cannot modify elements in a for each loop. And 3 is correct because it says if you wish to refer to elements through a variable name instead of an array index. Okay. So 1 and 3 would be the answers. Okay. It says, what is the output of the following code segment? I'm using a for each loop here, and it's multiplying 44 times 2, which gets 88, but never actually assigns it back to index 0. At the end, when I print out all the values, these values will not change. It will print back out 44, 33, 22, and 11, right? Even though I went through and multiplied each by 2, a tempting answer would be to put this one, right? This is a trickery one. This type of question may be on the AP exam, most likely will be. Or they'll try and trick you and say, hey, look, here's a for each loop. I'm going to multiply each of these by 2, right? But really, they're not assigned back to the array index. Okay. It says for each loop algorithms. Here's an object-oriented example that has the array as a private instance variable of a class that provides a public method average that uses a for each loop. Okay. So this is an example here of a for each loop algorithm. We have our constructor here. It passes in whatever the array values are and refers to it as values. This is then stored up here as my variable, okay? Then I have public double get average. This is a method inside of array worker. Totals assigned to 0. For each value inside of the values that are passed in, okay, it's going to take whatever the total is and add the value to it and assign it back to total. So if we run this, Let's see what happens. Okay, so it passes in 2, 6, 7, 12, and 5. From there, it adds those together and then finds the average. Okay, whatever the total is, it divides it by however many are in the values.length. So the average of 2, 6, 7, 12, and 5, if those were your scores, your average is a 6.4. Maybe those are measurements of, oh, you know what that would be a good measurement of? Snow. Right? We can say it snowed 2 inches one day, 6, 7. I would love for a 12 inches of snow day. This would be nice. Like, let's say this is tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. All together, that'd be a lot of snow. But the average of that would be 6.4. Okay. I'll reset this. Okay. It says the following method has the correct code to return the largest value in an integer called vals, an instance variable of the current object, but the code's mixed up. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to remember that this time it is indented, right? And I'm going to open and close. Whoops. I'm going to open and close my method. And it's called get largest. Okay. Then I'm going to, let's see here. I'm going to take my for loop, drag that out. I'm also going to close my for loop. Inside of it, I'm going to drag my if and end my if. Int largest equals vals. So if the item is larger than, if item is bigger than the largest, then the new largest becomes whatever that item is. And then maybe int largest goes there. Int largest equals vals of 0. I don't know. Let's check it. There you go. Okay, so get largest. I go ahead and assign whatever the largest is to the first value, right? And then loop through all the values. And if any item in the array is bigger than whatever the first one was, then it takes its place as the new largest. Okay. Given the array is an array of integers and target is an integer value, which of the following best describes the conditions under which the following code will return true? Okay. So I have a Boolean temp, which is assigned false. I then have a for each loop where each of the values of the array is going to be iterated through. And temp is assigned if target is equal to the value, then temp is going to be assigned the value of true, right? I'm sorry, there's no if. It will be assigned if it is true or false. If the value is equal to the target, it will be true. If it is not, then it will be assigned false, and then we'll return it. Okay. Whenever the first element in the array is equal to the target, no. Okay. It will loop all the way through before it returns it. Whenever the array contains any element which equals target, no, it will loop all the way through. Whenever the last element in array is equal to target, yes, that's what it will return. Whenever only one element in array is equal to target, no. Okay, so it would be C. All right, programming challenge. It says write a new version of the spell check method. So we did this in our last we did something similar to this using a for loop, but it says write a new version of the spell check method to use an enhanced for each loop instead of an index for loop. It should take a word as a parameter, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so I have a dictionary, right? So let's look at this. Let me zoom in here and I'll move up. Okay, imported all this stuff. I have a class called spell checker. Inside of it, I have an array called dictionary, and there's 10,000 words in this dictionary. Okay, from here it says write a spell check method. So I'll say public, and it's going to return false or true. So that's going to be a Boolean. It's going to return a Boolean value. And then I'm going to call this spell check. And then I will create my curly braces there. It takes a word as a parameter. So I'll say string word. And it says returns true if it is in the dictionary array. Okay. So it returns false if it is not found. So if I'll say open and close my if here. Write a spell check method that uses enhance for each loop to loop through. So I guess first, before I even write that if, I want to write my for. Okay. For, we'll say, where's a parameter? Enhance for each loop that takes a word as a parameter and returns true if it is not. So for each, I'll say string W in whatever, if it's in the dictionary. Okay. If word dot equals W, return true. So let me just make sure I'm going through this right. So if I'm going through each word in the dictionary. If word, okay, what's being passed in equals whatever W was passed in here, then return true. Okay. And I guess I need to write my for loop like this, right? Okay. If it goes all the way through and it's not in the dictionary, return false.
Should we return false in the for loop? No. No. No.
Right. So outside of it. So that was an issue that we had yesterday, was we tried returning false inside the for loop. And I was like, oh, let me write an else here, but that doesn't necessarily work there. Okay. So if the word that is being passed in, okay, so whatever word that is, okay, if it goes through every single word that's in the dictionary, right, if word equals that, return true, it's in here, else return false. I know we have more to do, but I'm just going to run it, right? Okay, so we have some more to do here, and we'll continue through. So that was the first piece. The second piece, it says, write a check text method that takes a string parameter. Let's see what I'm eventually returning. So it takes a string parameter, which is a sentence of text in a string array, and then calls your spell check method above to check if each word in that text is spelled correctly. Use an enhanced for each loop. It should count and print the misspelled words and then return the count. Okay, so if I'm returning count, this will be public int check text. Okay. And I'll zoom in a little bit. Move it this way, like there. Perfect. Okay, so right, check text method that takes a string parameter, which is a sentence. Okay, so I'm going to pass it in a sentence. And then calls your spell check method above to check if each word in that text is spelled correctly. Okay, so, and then calls your spell check method above to check if a word. So we'll say we'll write our for each loop here. Okay, so for string, so I'll say for each word inside of sentence, if so we are checking if a word in that text is spelled correctly. So we'll say if spell check and I'll spell check the word to make sure it's spelled correctly, right? And then I'll add an exclamation point out front because that will say if it's false, right? Remember this, if I just left this here, spell check will return true or false. If true, it would do something, but I'll say if false, since we want to count the number of misspelled words, right? It should return the count of that. So I'll make a variable called int count and assign it 0 to start. And if the word is spelled wrong, then I'll go ahead and add 1 to it. Okay. And then I think it says it should count and print out the misspelled word. Okay, so we'll say system dot out dot println. It should print out the misspelled word, so it will print out that word. Okay, then at the very end of our loop, once we've looped through everything, we'll return the count, the number of times we misspelled a word. Okay. I don't know. Let's see if that's right. I know I still have to do some other things, but let's see where I'm at. It's running it right now. Okay. So that looks good. Now the last piece is it wants me to uncomment out this section right here. Be careful what you uncomment, right? Because we don't want the situation we're trying to figure out what we're doing. So it says uncomment out. So I'm going to go to line 52. That's where at least mine is. It says See where it says uncomment out to test your method? I'm going to click right in front of it and click backspace, backspace, backspace. Okay. And then down here, right here, see how it says system.out.println, there were how many errors? I'm going to take that out as well. All right. Now let's run it. And there you go. Okay, so just recapping this, I have a dictionary. Inside my dictionary, there's 10,000 English words. Okay, from there, I create a method. Called spell check. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it in a word. Okay, what spell check does is it compares that word to every single word that's in the dictionary, right? And if it's in the dictionary, it will say, this is a word, it's spelled right. If it's not in the dictionary or spelled wrong, it will say, hey, you know what? This is spelled wrong. And we eventually use that down here in a method that we wrote called check text, where we pass it in an array called sentence. Okay. And what check text will do is it will return the number of times we had a typo and spelled something wrong. So I created a variable called count, assigned it to 0. And then for every word that's in this sentence that we passed in, okay, for every word, we're going to spell check it using the method we just wrote up there. Now, if it's not in the dictionary and we return, so spell check word should return true or false. If it returned true, that it is, okay, then this would return false right here because we would change it and not run this. Okay, we want to only run it if it actually was true. Okay, so if there is a word that's spelled wrong, then we want to go ahead here and add 1 to it and then print out the word that's spelled wrong. And then at the very end of it, return the count. Okay, and that's what we end up writing. The community, we don't design anything for our community, so we're going to keep going. Hit the save and run. I'm skipping over this for time's sake as well. Like I said, this is an optional thing you can add on if you want to. If for some reason you really feel compelled to go through and do it, by all means do it. But we're not doing with it. Also hit save run on this one. It's just a continuation of the same exact one. You're not missing anything. We're going to get more practice later on, so don't feel like you're getting cheaped out of this. So, all right, so for each loops, the summary, we talked about all this. I'm not going to read through it. And that is 6.3. Okay. Now, 6.4, it says array algorithms, right? This is just extra practice, right? Look at this. It gives you a free response question here, a free response question here. If you want to go through and do it, like I said, be my guest, but we are not doing 6.4. Okay. So this says free response questions. In this lesson, you will study different free response questions. We might go back to this and it might help us on the AP exam once we get closer to it, but it's not required right now. And we're trying to get through as much of this content as possible. We're on the right track. Okay. It goes through 641, 642, all these. I'm going to keep on going until I get to 6.5. Okay, unit summary. So all the things we talked about in unit 6, we mainly introduced arrays. In unit 7, we're going to talk about array lists. Okay. We talked about how to store it, right? How if you are creating an array of integers, it will automatically assign them all zeros. if you have an array of strings, until you overwrite it, it's going to have null in each of those values. Okay, we learned about arrays. We learned how to declare arrays. We also learned how to then also say, hey, I'm going to pass in to this array 5 values. By doing this, this actually starts them all at, in this case, null, because you have 5 strings. How to access different items using the index. This should not be a new concept. We did it, I think, earlier on with strings. And we also did an APCSP. Array initialization. This goes and shows me, look, if I create an array, int, and then square brackets, high scores, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scores. We started off the semester really well, and then we got these scores towards the end, 68, not good, right? Shows you how to initialize an array. It has 5 values in it. You can also find the length by just using the dot separator and typing length, right? So scores.length 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would return 6. You can refer to an item via its reference, okay? So a specific element, you can refer to it via its reference. Notice that it starts counting at 0. So given that if it's the actual second element in the array, right, like the first one, the second one, that will actually be index 1. So whatever the length is, -1. We just finished talking about for each loops, so I'm not going to get into too much detail there. And we also talked about out of bounds exceptions, where maybe, especially if you're writing your loop, that you are forgetting that we are stopping before we reach the end of the array. If we move too far in one direction, then we'll get an out of bounds exception. The same way when a ball in a sport goes out of bounds, right? You don't want to do that, right? So you don't want to go out of bounds and move outside of your array. Some keywords we talked about, for mainly. Okay, vocab practice. It says drag the item from left and drop it in its corresponding answer. So the number of elements in the array, the number of it would be the length. The index of the second element in an array would be 1. The index of the first element in an array would be 0. The index of the last element would be whatever the length is -1, considering computers start counting as 0. That's what it looks like. Let's check it. Looks good. Okay, more. Initialize a string array named list1 to contain the first 3 letters of the alphabet as separate strings. I'm going to drag that down, A, B, C. Declare an integer array named nums. Did that. Declare and create a string array called list1 that can hold 3 elements. They will all be assigned to null as well because I haven't given them specific numbers or specific, in this case, specific strings. Initialize an array of integers named nums to contain the first 3 whole numbers. There you go. Now, I was told, as a math teacher, I was told that whole numbers include 0. I was told that counting numbers start at 1, or natural numbers, that whole numbers include 0. So they might need to come up with a different word because that's confusing. Some common mistakes. I made some of these mistakes even, so they're common. Making sure we create an array By now, we should know that we start counting at 0. An out of bounds, index out of bounds exception, jumping out of a loop too early. These are all common mistakes. 6.5. Let's keep going. 6.6, mixed up code practice. Okay, try to solve each of the following. It says the following program should loop from 0 to less than the length of the array and double each element in the array and print out the new values on the same line separated by a comma. Okay, so we'll go ahead first and start with our array. So int array is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to write a for loop. I'm going to close it there. Someone's phone's ringing. That's mine. Not sure who that is. Oh, well, I'll answer it later. And what we'll do here is we will take each element, multiply it by 2, and then we will print out that value. Let's check it. Perfect. Okay, moving on. The following program segment should fill an array with elements that count from 0 to 50 by 5. 0, 5, 10. The blocks have been mixed up. Okay, so let's go ahead first, create our array. Okay, so in the array, there's going to be integers, and it's going to have 11 values in the array. I'll open up my for loop. I'll then close it. I'm going to multiply each value by 5. And then print out each of the values. Perfect. Well done. Okay, next one. It says the following program should print each element in the array that is even using an enhanced for each loop. Okay, so now we're using a for each loop. First, these are the elements in the array. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 elements in it. And I'm going to open my for loop. I'm going to close it. Okay, and in it, I'll say if the value, when you divide it by 2, the modulus, remember, if it is divisible by 2 evenly, I want to print the value out. So what this will do is it will look at 14. Is 14 even? Yes. Is -5 even? No. So it will print out 14. It will print out 2. It will skip over 17, skip over 29. It will print out -8 and print out 36. Check it. Well done. All right, the following program segment is a method that should return the smallest integer given an array of integers. But the blocks have been mixed up. Okay, so we will start with, well, let me read this again. It says, it should return the smallest integer given an array of integers. So I have my public static int find smallest, and I'll close it. And I'll go ahead and drag my for loop in there. And I'll close my for loop. I'll say, before I even start my for loop, I'll go ahead and assign smallest to whatever value is in the array. That's the first one, right? And we'll say if array I is less than the smallest, then we will close it. Then the smallest is assigned whatever value we are currently dealing with. And then at the very end, once we've gone through our loop, we'll return the smallest value. Okay, we look over this one last time. I'm assuming it doesn't want this one over here. So we'll run it. Perfect. All right, so we left one block out. We didn't need it. Find smallest. We went ahead and took our very first element in our array and we assigned it to the smallest. Then I loop through all of the elements in the array. And if any item, each element is smaller than the array, smaller than the smallest one already in the array, then it reassigns whatever the smallest variable is as an int variable. And at the very end, once my for loop is done, we return it. Okay. Let me see what this is. Okay. Moving on, this one, it says the following program segment is a method that should return the average given an array of integers, the parameter. Okay, so the average. So we'll go ahead and create a method here called find average. I'll end it. And if we want to find the average, I guess starting off here, I'll assign the sum, a variable called sum. Well, if I'm adding things up, maybe I int sum. Well, I guess we'll say double. Should return the average given an array of integers. Okay. So if they're integers, if I'm adding it up, I'll keep it like that. And then I'll add my for loop in here. And we'll loop through each. And we'll say sum is when we add them all up. Okay. And once we've added them all up, at the very end, once my loop is over, right, I'm going to go ahead and take the sum divided by the array length. Now, if we want the answer to be a double, right, we should probably, maybe I'll backtrack here. And I'll put this in there. Double sum is assigned 0 instead of int sum. Yeah, that's what it wants. In reading through it, I realized if you're dividing like, I don't know, 17 divided by 3, right? And if you're putting that into an int, that wouldn't make sense. So safer in most cases, use double. I left int over there. The following program segment is a method that should return the largest integer given an array of integers. Okay, so I have my find largest, and I'm being passed in an array of integers. I'm then going to close that. We'll go ahead and before we start looping through it, we'll say, all right, the largest, int largest is assigned the first element in the array, which is 0, or sorry, which is the 0th index. And then my for loop is right here. And I'll end my for loop. So int I is assigned 0 as long as I is less than the array length. That looks good. If largest is less than, I'll close my if here. If largest is less than whatever element's in there, then what I need to do is I need to assign largest to whatever we are working with, right? Because it would be bigger there. At the very end, once we're done our for loop, we want to return the largest in it. We take another glance at that. Let's see if we got it right. Yep. Okay, so find largest. I have my method here. I have my int largest, which is assigned to the first element in this array. I then loop through all the elements of the array and say, hey, look, this first value, whatever it is, if it's less than the new value, then the new value is now the new record, the new largest. Think of like a high score or record, right? We'll loop through all the elements and then return what's finally the largest. One of these where I have to drag it down. That's enough. I like it when it's next to each other. It says the following program segment is a method that should return an integer array that is right shifted by 1 so that 3253 returns 3625. Okay. Interesting. So let's think of this logically. We'll walk through this. This one might be a little bit slower in explaining the logic behind it. So shift right, right? So if I'm taking 6253, I'm shifting all these numbers right 1, but if 3 is shifted right 1, it then gets bumped to the front, right? So it kind of just goes to the front. So then 3625. So let's write this. Okay. So I have my shift right method here. And what it will return is going to be the new array. So let's say drag my for loop down. Once again, the technique that I use is by hitting the down arrow to make sure it goes down there, or you could zoom out. I'm going to go ahead and close my for loop. And then I'll say, it says int result equals new int array length. Okay, so maybe I put this up here. It's a new array, int array, and however long the previous array was that's being passed in is going to be the same. And my for loop, I'm going to loop through each of them. And as I loop through, it says result I plus 1 is assigned whatever I was. Let me check this. So if I'm at index 0, I add 1 to it, and then I'm assigning that to, well, then that would overtake result 0 is assigned that first value. let me see here. So result 0 is assigned whatever the array is, array.length, right? Then let me return this at the end. Once we're done our for loop, let me just see if this makes sense here. So I have my for loop. Before I started, I put the very first element in the result array is going to be whatever was at the very end gets bumped there. So then 0 plus 1 is assigned whatever was in array I. Let's check it. Your blocks are in the wrong order. Array minus 1 I plus plus. What did I? Oh, array. No, array length. This can be fixed by resulting the blocks. Return result. So anyone offer input here of what needs to be switched? It wants the other 4?
Yeah.
The array length minus 1.
Since I plus 1, so we got a minus 1.
Oh, silly mistake. Wow. As long as I is less than array length minus 1, because we're not going to go to the last element in the array there. Gotcha. Int I is assigned 0. I is less than the array length minus 1. Okay, because we're already going to push that first one to the beginning of it. Got it, got it, got it. All right, moving through, next one. The following program segment is a method that should return a new array of length 2 containing the middle 2 elements of a given array of integers of even length. So, should return a new array of length 2 containing the middle 2 elements. So if it were 1, 2, 3, 4, it would return 2 and 3. So we're going to create a method called makeMiddle, and it's going to return a array there. So let's look at this. So we're going to create a result, and it's going to be a new array, and it's going to have 2 answers, the 2 middle ones. And then, so let's read some of this code. So I have int middle index is whatever the length is divided by 2. So if I had a list of 4 characters and divided it by 2, that would then give me 2, which would be element 0, 1, 2. So I then need to subtract 1 from it. Okay. And then the middle index is going to be, the result 0 is going to be whatever the middle index is, and then return the result. Okay. The reason why I subtracted 1, because like I said, if you use the 4 element one up above here as an example, 1, 2, 3, 4, there are 4 elements in this array. Okay. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So the reason why this one wouldn't work is index 2, 0, 1, 2, that's 3, and that's not right. We want to start at 2, so we have to subtract 1 from it, and that's why we subtracted 1 there. many more we got? We got 2 more. Let's do it. The following program segment is a method that should return string array, that is in reverse order. So BAZ should return ZAB. God bless you. Okay, this is weird. It's like attached. That's weird. I never went through that one before, and it was like already there. So I'll go ahead and drag this over. So I have reverse this method here, and it's going to return an array. Starting off here, I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, for my result array, which will be my answer, which I'll eventually return, right? Return will be at the very end. And I'll just put that now there because we know we're going to eventually return the result. But it's going to be of the same length. Okay, recognize that we're going to take this array and put it backwards. So it says Z, A, B. Okay, so let's look at, I'll also assign int I, whatever the array length is, -1. Okay, so I'll say for, open up my for loop. Well, if I'm just going through here, I'm changing it. So I can't use a for each loop, right? So BAZ return. Okay, well, I guess I'm using a for each loop. It says reverse order. I guess since I'm creating a new array, that's probably why. So I'm creating a new array. I'm not changing the elements in the original array. I'm creating a new array, so I can use a for each loop. And I'll go ahead and end my for loop here. And I'll say the result is going to be whatever number we're starting with here. So length -1, whatever element that is, assign it to this element of whatever we started with. Element originally is the first, is whatever value that we're dealing with in the array. And I believe that is right. Check it. Correct. Okay. So what we did here, we have our for loop. We have our very first new array result. So we loop through and say, all right, this first value, okay, well, I guess the last value in it is whatever the first element is in the first array. And then we work backwards, right? So we're moving sequentially through one array while we're moving backwards through the other. Last one. Copies the first half of an array. So we want to copy the first half. So that's my method. We're going to return an array, a list of an array of integers. I also want to define the result. Okay, the result is going to be an array, and in it, it's going to be however long that array is divided by 2. That's how long it's going to be. From there, I'm going to go ahead and open up my for loop. Let me look at this real quick. So divided by, okay. So this is the 2 possible to loop all the way through or to only loop through the result actual loop. So I'll go ahead and close that, or the result array, not the result loop, the result array. And each time I'll go ahead and assign it to whatever the array was. The first, we're not going to go all the way through, obviously. We're only going to go halfway through because we're only returning the first half, and then return it. Well done. That's what we have as our answer. Okay. And that is 6.6, mixed up code. Questions on that? We're going to go ahead and stop here for today after completing 6.6. And we will pick back up, I believe, starting at 6.7 next class.